But yeah, let's take a look at what else people are talking about in the news today. Joining me, we've got Lettice. Lettice, good to see you. She's in the studio, which is lovely. And Professor Scott Lucas joins us down the line. Good afternoon to you both.
Afternoon.
Okay, let's start taking a look at the rail strike. So the strike's still continuing into 2023. I'll tell you what, 23 is looking a lot like 2022.
I know.
For all the wrong reasons.
For all the wrong reasons.
all the wrong reasons. But yes, rail strikes continue. However, there's signs, rumblings that potentially some people, rail workers could be getting tired of all of this.
Yeah, exactly. The pressure is very much on at the moment, particularly on the RMT, but also on the government. So what we've seen reported in the Daily Mail today is that half of rail staff are actually crossing the picket lines and going back to work. I think a lot of this comes from the disgruntlement that in December a deal was put on the table of which a third of these rail staff approved of. It was a 9% pay rise over 2 years. They were happy with that, but it did get rejected. And now there's the added pressure that Grant Shapps on Wednesday, the business secretary, came out and announced that bill in the House of Commons to put in minimum service level requirements. And I think there's a concern that they will slowly start to lose their bargaining power with the government if this bill happens to go through.
So, Scott, last Friday and Saturday saw the highest attendance rates since last summer, and it's a sign. I don't think it's good news for the unions, but it is a sign that staff themselves are actually tiring of going on strike.
You have to realize that for some staff, you take a financial hit when you're forced by the government's position to face possibly months of effectively being out of work. So that, yes, you will have some staff crossing lines, although I'd be very, very careful of a report in that particular newspaper, which quite often is not actually based on hard fact, but on what they want to be true. I think this gets back to a fundamental, though, and I think Lettice came down to it, which is both sides trying to get back around the table. And the fact is that although 1/3 of rail people may have actually said, look, we'll take the deal, the majority still are not happy with the fact that you're only getting 4% per year over 2 years. And especially if inflation continues to run at 9–10%, that's going to be an issue. It's also going to be an issue that the government injected conditions when it looked like we were making advances in the negotiations, for examples over driver-only trains. Now, I think that's saying that in a way, Lettice is right, that the union has to realize its members can't go on indefinitely. But alternatively, I think the government's playing a very dangerous game if it thinks that just simply by refusing to negotiate and reach a compromise, that this is going to be good for them,
the government
good for the unions, and good for all of us.
This is, I have to say, one thing that is different about 2023. There appears to be more talks. The government is more involved than they've ever were last year. But what do you make of their move, which Lettice mentioned, making striking tougher? Wouldn't affect rail drivers, though, I have to say, but striking tougher for some public sector workers.
First of all, Claudia, I think you're right on the nurses. I think Steve Barclay is now negotiating with the nurses and with other medical staff. That's not true on the rail side. In terms of the strike action, look, it's a diversion. It's a diversion by saying, we will make these strikes illegal, which, by the way, probably isn't, in fact, legal under international law. We'll make these strikes illegal is to divert headlines from the fact that the negotiations haven't really advanced. Instead of sitting down and negotiating, you say, we will get you, we will get you. Now, if they pass the anti-strike law, realize that, first of all, it's a severe curtailment of human rights. You might not like that the rail workers are on strike. You might not like that the nurses are on strike. But the right to strike is something that workers fought for since the 19th century. So for the government to be so draconian about this,
should be a bit careful about how we say it's curtailment of human rights here. These minimum service level agreements would only be put in place so that people like ambulance staff, ambulance workers, allowing them to be able to still save lives. If all ambulance workers went on strike at the same time and there was no minimum service level requirement, people would die. The impact of that would be catastrophic. They're still allowed to strike. There's nothing about that that's taking it away. It's simply saying that there needs to, in some of these key sectors, in some of these really important areas, there needs to be a bit of a minimum service level requirement.
Yeah, but Lettice, that's a diversion. Because in fact, as you know, the nurses, the doctors, the ambulance workers worked with the NHS management to ensure minimum service levels. that rail workers have been working in some areas to work with in terms of minimum service levels in terms of emergency situations. So the government was using this as spin to say, oh, look, they're putting us all in danger by implying that they weren't pursuing the minimum service levels. And that's why I have a problem with it. If you're talking about a serious piece of legislation to talk about protecting people during strikes, fair enough. But to use it as a diversion from the issues around the strikes, no, that's politics.
Okay.
That's not actually helping us.
Just got a tweet from somebody's Twitter handle. His name is 100% Union on Twitter. They say rail strikes are set to continue. The government are playing hokey-cokey politics, saying anything to undermine workers. Changing the law to make it hard to strike is pathetic. What happens when workers just down tools and walk out? No union involvement. Okay, so yeah, this person very, very against any legislation making things tougher for workers to strike. Lettice, let's take a look at the latest on Brexit. Remember that? Just when you thought it was forgotten. It's still going on largely because of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Yes. And there could potentially be developments there. Yeah, exactly. We're hopefully seeing this sort of light. There is finally a bit of good news, potentially. So earlier this week, the shining light that is that there was agreement that was made about data sharing between Brussels and the UK. And essentially it was saying that we will now be sharing data of goods that are going between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and so on and so forth. And it means that what has been said is there will be shelving the Brexit protocol bill that was brought in by Liz Truss, which was essentially going to kind of curtail this and say that we, the UK, could unilaterally make changes to the protocol. It doesn't take a genius to see that it is not working. That protocol is not working. The DUP is refusing to return to Stormont. They have not been there since February 2022. The people of Northern Ireland, they need a government, so something needs to be done. And what we're going to see from tomorrow on January 16th is these tunnel negotiations, essentially very, very intense negotiations where hopefully we will see some shift and some change. Which I think is very positive news. Scott, this does look like both sides are bending, if you like, and trying to work together.
Well, it's what should have been done 3 years ago, because when you put in the customs line between Northern Ireland and the UK, the question always was, well, how are you going to monitor the goods that go back and forth for health and safety reasons, as well as the question of not letting them be a backdoor way to avoid customs going either into the UK or into the EU. And the UK government wasn't ready for it. And so they didn't get ready for it. Instead, they spent 3 years trying to play hardball over the Northern Ireland Protocol, which not only antagonized the EU, equally important, it antagonized the US, which meant that it scuppered possibilities for the UK-US trade deal. So it's a welcome shift, especially on the part of London. I hope Lettice is absolutely right. Tunnel negotiations are the way to go. Keep publicity away from this, keep people from playing politics with it, and hopefully we'll see an improved situation because, frankly, the collapse in trade between Northern Ireland and the UK has been a serious economic damage on both sides of the channel. Of the Irish Sea.
Okay, so our main question that we're asking people today is we got news yesterday, financial news, that the GDP, UK GDP is up by 0.1%. That sounds like positive news, but really wanted to ask our viewers and listeners, how are they still struggling with the cost of living? Get in touch on that 0344499 1000. It's so interesting. Is this the Express today? Oh, one of the papers today talking about Tesco putting padlocks on things like bacon. I think this is such a depressing story. That particular story in that Tesco's Express, which is actually in Southwark, not far from here, it's actually been taken down now. But I think it speaks to this wider issue that these staple foods. I remember back in summer it was butter, and we had Lurpak hitting £6, and it was being tagged by Aldi because it was being taken so much. What sort of country are we becoming when things that are just staple, basic necessities that you would have in your kitchen, butter, bacon, things like that, are being tagged because they're being taken so much because people can't really afford the cost of living? Scott, honestly, we are in extraordinary times. This is the kind of thing that would be saved for maybe technology, right? Devices, alcohol, sausages, bacon being put in padlocks.
It's a fundamental. It's not going to be popular with a lot of your viewers, but when you put barriers up to markets, which is what Brexit did, you affect the ability to trade back and forth, and you affect supply chains. And the fact of the matter is that even though we've had that mini bump, as you mentioned, so we're up 0.1% for 1 month, we are losing relatively 4% of GDP each year. We lost $100 billion this year. Now, that means the government loses tax revenues, but more importantly, as you pointed out, it means that people find it harder to get the essentials. I'm just going to say this one more time. If we were talking economics and politics, Britain should rejoin the European Union single market, or at least establish the same arrangement that Switzerland has, so that you can actually move goods back and forth more easily. Because until it does, it effectively has isolated itself by the way that it's playing Brexit, and it's people at the lower ends of this country that get hurt by it.
OK, Professor Scott Lucas and Lettice Bromovsky, so good talking to you both, going through to the main headlines in the papers today.